Hello, Craig here. We're going to run through the JavaScript portion of the ToDo App assignment. So if you've been following along in class, you may have already done most of this. I'm just going to kind of run through from the beginning, trying to explain each step really well. So if you're struggling to understand, JavaScript and how it works and what we're trying to accomplish, hopefully this will be helpful. We'll kind of walk through each step. And yeah, so let's go ahead and jump in. Switch this here. First thing we need to do is get an API key, which, by the way, if you go to the CSE204.craigh.net/ToDo API, this is linked in Canvas. This is the API documentation. So this page explains in as much detail as I could how the API works. And by the way, this is a very standard pattern for creating APIs. This is following a REST pattern. And so very, very common. This API is something that may exist in the world that you may have to interact with, as part of a web development job. So this is, not a... This is a very common pattern, and interacting with APIs is a big part of a web development job. So that's kind of the purpose behind this assignment and why we are doing this, is to kind of get that practice. Because again, what the API is doing for us is saving our data on a server that's centralized. So the user, as they come back to our page, they'll have the same data. And they can maybe load the page on multiple devices and it'll all interact with the same data. So that's kind of why we're using this API, to save our data behind the scenes. We're not dealing with user authentication or anything like that. Eventually we would probably add a login so that the user would log in, verify who they are so they're getting their data, things like that. That's kind of beyond the scope of this assignment. So this page should be really helpful. So I really encourage you to give it a read, try and understand. I talk here about the ToDo data object. So what properties each ToDo has when it's saved in the database. Then I overview the different API methods that are available. So, and I kind of explain what they're for. So there's a URL here, /ToDos. This one has a method of get. It has no request body. And then the response looks like this. So it's an array of different ToDos with all those properties. There's actually more properties there as well. I didn't add all of them just so this wouldn't get super long. But all of these properties listed up here will come back in your response body. And then I explain list ToDos. This endpoint returns an array of all ToDos for the provided user. And then you can click this link here to kind of get this good walkthrough as well as a full JavaScript example of making that API request in JavaScript. So really helpful. I've done a lot of, try to give you as much information here as possible. Here's creating a ToDo by sending a post, and you have to send a request body that looks like this, and then you'll get a response with the full object for what you created. Here's the get a ToDo. So if you want to get a specific ToDo, this one you actually don't have to use for the assignment. You may want to if you want to, loop through. The thing is, this array of list all ToDos returns fully populated ToDo objects. So you don't actually have to ever call this specific get a ToDo. It's just kind of there because it should be. If you're trying to build a cool feature or something new, you might have a need for that. Here's where you update a ToDo. So you send a put with this data, so you can update certain properties. So in our case, we're updating completed to true. You could also update the text property to if you wanted to create a way for users to edit their ToDos. That would be going above and beyond. And then you can also delete a do by sending a delete request to the URL here. And by the way, whenever you see this ID in brackets, the brackets and the ID should be replaced with the ID of your ToDo without the brackets. The brackets are just there to indicate that it's a parameter. So again, kind of a good overview. Also, I really kind of explain each one. Here's the URL. Here are the patterns, and then I've got the JavaScript example that kind of walks you through exactly what you need to do. So we'll be referencing this as we create our app. So I've got a fully functioning one here, but we'll go ahead and delete all of our JavaScript so we can start from scratch. So I'll start off by just kind of showing you my HTML. It's very, very basic. And in fact, let me see if I can get some of, if I undo, nope. Let me copy the HTML for one of these. I just want to show you, I really recommend when you're building an application like this to go ahead and write out some HTML for the data that's going to be populated. So I'm going to copy this HTML and I'm going to paste it. Right here. Okay, so this here is kind of how I have my HTML designed to, and I'll go ahead and break these out just to help you see that a little better. And add this on a new line. So this is just how again, I recommend you kind of do this HTML first so that you have something to work with and you can kind of do your styling and kind of get things to look how you want, and then add the JavaScript to do the AJAX and pull the data in. So again, it's a lot easier if you go ahead and have a, some HTML that works and looks good. So for instance, if I refresh this page now, let's leave this up for now. I've got that one to do in there. So again, develop this, just put in a fake ID, just make this 1, 2, 3, 4. You're not going to have real data here. You're just kind of mocking out what your data will look like. Make this a test to do. And I would also go ahead and make 2 of them at least, just so you can kind of see what that looks like. Make this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and make this another test to do, something along those lines, so that you can see what it looks like when you have 2 of them. Here, for instance, I've got a dotted line in between them. So that's CSS that I've already written. So again, just to kind of briefly go over the structure of my HTML, really simple. I use a section here to contain all of my to-dos. I've got an aside here at the top that contains my form for a new to-do. Again, these could just be divs. I've just used section aside just to be HTML5 fancy. I'm really not liking these pop-ups that Visual Studio Code always uses. I've switched over to Visual Studio Code, by the way, for a React project, because Visual Studio Code seems to work a little better for React than Sublime. Tangent. So I've got my form here for my new to-dos. It's got an ID, and then that form has an input in it of type text with a placeholder of new to-do, just so that the user can see that's where they're supposed to put a new to-do in. And then I've got a button with ID of new submit and a little plus sign here in the button. So that is what creates this form up here. So this button here is my submit button, and this is my input. So if I select this, I can do, type in it. And then obviously I've styled this quite a bit in CSS, and I'll show you that here in 1 second. So after my aside that contains my form, I've got articles for my actual to-dos. So each to-do is an article. Again, article is a good HTML element to use when you've got repeating content like a blog post or a comment, or in our case, a to-do. So they each have an ID and class to-do. And then inside of that article, I've got a button for my checkbox when I check off to-dos. You could use something else here. You could use a link, you could use an image, you could use a form input, all kinds of options. In my case, I've got a button. I also have a paragraph for my actual to-do text. Again, you could use a span. That would probably make sense. And then I've got a button for my delete button. to remove the to-do, and I've got a a little minus, a little dash in here for that. So then I can have a second article with that a second to-do, and then make sure you include your JavaScript. So I've got my script source equals scripts.js, and this is at the end of my page so that it will load after the whole page is loaded. So really simple. I've also included my CSS up here at the top. So pretty simple, nothing too complicated. I spent a while doing some CSS for my styling. So again, I'll just really briefly go over this. I've set like my to-dos section. I've set width 60%, margin left and right auto so that it'll be centered on the page, but not take up the full width. Set some margin, some padding. Set a border around that container, so that's what creates this light border here. And then I just kind of made it a little bit wider on a smaller screen. Again, just kind of basic styling. Here's my, the new title is the input for my to-do title. So, I set border to none. But then I set border bottom, excuse me, 1 pixel with a light gray. Outline none is how you have the form input not glow with an outline around it when you've selected it. If without that, let me show you, go to this input. If I take off, oh, it's on the, by the way, these, I don't know if you can, you probably can't see because of, there, now maybe you can see. In the inspector, when you've selected an element, over here on the right where you see all of your styles, you can, see your styles, but you can also select different states. So I can say active. In this case, meaning that I'm, well, I guess that would be clicking really at what I want is focus. So here now you can see the styles that are applied on focus, which is really nice. So I can uncheck my outline none, and there you see there's a really faint outline around the form as it's in focus. So again, outline none is what takes that away. So really nice feature here in the inspector, by the way, if you want to test hover, because you can't really hover while typing, CSS here into your inspector. So like, for instance, on my check buttons, I made them, I did some styling here where I set some border radius to make them kind of rounded. I added a border of 2 pixels around them. I made them square, width and height is 30 pixels. I floated left to have them go, make sure they're all the way on the left. And then you can look, if I select hover here, you'll see, you can see what it actually looks like in a hover state. And you can see here, I've set the background color on hover. So just kind of some nice features of the inspector. So going back to my CSS, that's really about it. This is all just pretty basic stuff that we've covered in class. I'm going to move this back down here so it stays out of the way. Let's see. This is something that I may not have covered in class, this last of type. So this is a pseudo class where you can select an element and then do colon and then last of type, and it will only apply that rule if it is the last element of that type. So that's how I added border bottom 1 pixel dotted to each of my to-dos except for the last one. So the last one does not have that border bottom because I said border bottom none. So that's kind of nice. Did some stuff on my paragraphs here. Here's my check. You'll notice I added a todo.completed class, and I do some different styling on that. So I make the color light gray. So text decoration line through here actually needs to be on the paragraph. And, you know, I set the background color on the check. I've got my delete button, style on hover and active. Again, here's where I really like using HSL, plug for that, because I'm just doing red. And nice, you know, was kind of complaining about Visual Studio Code. Here they do a nice color picker, except they changed my color. Oh, maybe not. That was kind of annoying. But we've got, you know, a red because it's 0, and then, you know, 50% saturation. Yeah, this is kind of annoying. But then we can choose a darker by reducing the lightness. So on hover, it gets darker, and then on active, it gets even darker. So again, if I wanted to make this, you know, a slightly different red, you know, I could pretty easily. Okay, so that is our styling. Just a brief overview. Well, you can look up on Canvas the needed, you know, elements. I'm going to kind of outline them here. Again, so when we start to think about our JavaScript, you know, I really recommend first thinking through what it is you need to accomplish, and even kind of outlining what your solution is going to look like. So just kind of outline what are the different things that you need to accomplish in your JavaScript. So I'm going to do that with comments, and then we'll kind of add, you know, our code as we go. So the first thing we need to do, let's just, you know, think through our, you know, kind of our page load. The first thing we need to do is load existing to-dos and display on page. Actually, let's break this out on 2. Load existing to-dos, display to-dos on page. We also need to handle form submit. So handle new to-do form submit, and display new to-do on page. We also then need to handle to-do completion, which will, you know, and we could, you know, get even more specific here. We could say event listener on button click. Then we'll say API call to delete, and then we can say remove from page. Or no, not remove from page, add class. Sorry, I was getting confused there. API call, we'll say put to set completed to true. And then we'll say add completed, or what is my class? Yeah, completed class. Then we can say handle to do deletion. We can say event listener. API call delete to remove, and then remove from page. So that's, you know, a pretty good outline. So just doing something like this kind of can help you wrap your mind around the different steps that you need to take. And then you can use the different JavaScript elements we've learned so far to kind of fill that in. So one, you know, kind of issue here is that we kind of have a chicken and the egg situation where if we handle our new to-do form submit, we don't really, you know, we won't, I mean, we'll kind of know if it works, but we'll need to actually, you know, render those on the page. If we start with load existing to-dos, we don't have any to-dos by default. So I'm actually going to recommend that we do the new to-do form submit and display that new to-do on the page first. So we'll handle this first before we do anything else. So the very first thing we need to do is grab our API key. So on the documentation page here, generate an API key here. We'll put in our name. Spoiler, it doesn't really matter what you put in here. You know, it doesn't, it just, all it does is use this data to generate a random unique token, but it's also time-based. So, you know, you can generate new ones and you'll notice that it changes. So, you know, all that really matters is that we get something unique. No one else should have this API token, and it should be pretty hard to guess someone else's because there's a lot of entropy here. It's very long. So we've got our API key, and let's go ahead and save that. Let's say var API key equals, and we're going to save this as a string. So now we need to handle new to-do form submit, and we'll do that by calling our, we'll create an event listener for the submit action, and we will attach it to our form. So I'll just pull up the, you know, again, Google is your friend. If you're not 100% sure how to handle that, we can do a quick Google and kind of see. So I'll just show you, you know, JavaScript handle form submit. That's all we gotta do. I'm using DuckDuckGo, which I really like, but they pull up a Stack Overflow by default, which is nice. And here we can see they create a function, they've got their prevent default, and then down here they actually use attach event submit or add event listener. And so if we go back and look, I always recommend using the MDN page. There's a few other ways to do this, by the way. There's also like an onSubmit property, but that's not the correct way to do it. It'll work, but there's also the jQuery way, which is using .submit. So if you're using jQuery, it'll look a little bit different. We'll look at this, the MDN web docs. I always like their documentation. So sending form data, oh, they're using an onClick. Let's see. Oh, this is really just doing Ajax. Let's do this search in Google real fast, just to see if we get a better result. On submit, what we're looking for is the add event listener submit. So we'll just say JavaScript. I could type add event listener on form submit. And the add event listener here, the property is submit. So let's go ahead and first select our element, or select our form. So document is how we access everything. .get element, oops. The capitalization here is very important. ID, and the ID of our form is new to do form. So get element by ID, new to do form. And then we're going to say add event listener. And this takes two properties. The first one is the event, in our case submit. And the second one is the function that we want to run whenever that event happens. This could be a specific named function. We don't really have a need for that, so we can just put the function right in here. So we'll say function, and this gets an event parameter just by default. And then we open up our brackets. This is starting to get a little bit long, and we want to make sure we put a semicolon here. So again, add event listener, type is submit. and then the callback. So what happens after that event happens is it will run the function that we put inside these brackets, and it'll pass it the event variable, which is an object which contains all of the information about our event. And we'll need that for one thing that I'll show you here in a second. Again, let's just go to the add event listener documentation, just so we can see this. We can look at it here as well. W3 Schools is not ideal, but they at least make things pretty easy to understand. So document add event listener. We've got, the different parameters here. So event, and then our function. There's actually a third parameter, use capture, which is a Boolean that we won't actually use. You can read about that if you would like. Again, they've got some more examples here. You can use it this way, so you can just put in a function name, and then that function gets called. So that's one way of doing it. And then you can also do it here, where you've got your event and then the function itself. So that's the way that we're handling it. I'm not sure if they show you the different types of events. Yeah, DOM event object reference. So here are some of the different events that you can see. So you can do an event on change. So that's nice. I use that a lot if I'm doing like autocomplete or like a search and I want to populate my search every time a new character is typed. So like Google uses that. They have a change event listener. Click, obviously. You can do like, cut, copy, things like that. Double click. If you want to handle one user double click. So if you're building a, more interactive application, these are the types of things that you might use. In our case, we'll go down here to submit. Occurs when a form is submitted. Here's an example where you can just do it in your HTML, but again, we're not doing that because that's not the correct way. So, there's kind of an example of where you would look at the documentation. So let's go ahead and do two things. First, let's do our event.prevent default. So I mentioned this in a lecture a while back. So again, we have this event, and in fact, we can, console log event, if I could type. And let's go ahead and just see what this does, because that'll illustrate why we need to do prevent default. So we save this, we refresh our page. Anytime you update your JavaScript, you've got to refresh. We will type some stuff in here, and we will open the console so we can see, and we hit enter. So what happened? Why don't we see our console log? You'll notice if you watch really closely, you'll see something show up there for a quick second, and then it disappears. In fact, if we, I like to do this just to kind of illustrate. If we put a bunch of these, you'll see all of those. So you see how there were a bunch of console logs. So what is happening is our JavaScript runs, but this is still a form that the browser attempts to submit. If we go to our HTML, this form isn't actually properly formed. It doesn't have an action. So by default, the action then is just whatever page you're on. So it's the same, the current URL. And the default method is get. So this form, when we submit it, it's trying to make a GET request to the current page. And what effectively is happening is it just refreshes because it just makes a GET to the current page, which returns the current page. So that's what's happening is when we submit this form, even though our JavaScript runs, the page tries to refresh because it's trying to, make the call. If we change this to like action equals, let's just do google.com. and see what happens. It actually redirects us to google.com because it's making a GET request to google.com, which redirects our browser there. So we need to stop this. That's not the behavior that we want. We need to stop that from happening. JavaScript provides a very simple way of doing that using this event object. So event.prevent default. That's all we have to do. It has to be camel case. Most of these, most JavaScript methods are camel case, meaning it starts off lowercase and then each word is capitalized. So event.prevent default. So it's preventing the default action of that event. So if we use this on a click event, it would, say maybe we've got a link that goes to google.com and we want to handle that click. We can handle it in JavaScript and we can say prevent default and it would stop the link from actually happening. So now when we go back, refresh our page, put in something, we will see now we get the actual event console logged. So we can see things like the target. So this is what the, the target that the event happened on. I recommend kind of scrolling through this and kind of seeing what all we have in here. We've got a bunch of different properties. So all these kinds of, things you can kind of dig into. We can see a bunch of the, properties of the target and kind of dig into that. So that's really useful. So let's go ahead and clear our console. We'll get rid of our console log. We know this is happening. We've got the event.prevent default. So now what we need to do is get the text. So someone in class pointed out that an easy way to get the text is just to select the input by its ID. That's actually added to, in this submit event listener, we have each input by its ID. So the ID of my text input here is new title. And this has to be camel case. If you have dashes in here, that it won't work correctly. So if we just say new title, and let's console log it and see what results. What we're going to see is that full HTML element. So by console logging new title, we have that input available to us. And you can't see it here, but it has a value attached to it. So if we console log new title dot value, now we're seeing the actual text that we put in. So anything that we put in here, that's 1, 2, 3, foo, those all show up when we submit the form. So that's really great. That's really all we need now to send to the server, to the API to save our to-do. So now we need to go ahead and submit to-do to API. So we're going to do that with our post call. So again, I'll show you here how much of this work I've already done for you. If we go to our documentation page and we go down to our post method, create a to-do, and we click more info, and we look at our JavaScript example, we can see what all it is that we have to send, and we can see all of the JavaScript steps to do that. I'd prefer you not to just copy and paste this whole thing. There may be some typos in there, and you're gonna kind of have to modify it for your use a little bit, but you can kind of use this as a guide to walk through. So the first thing we need to do is create an object with our text property, because that's what the server is expecting, is an object with the text property. That's just the way that my server, my API is set up. Different APIs may, handle different types of body info, but for us, we have to create an object that has a text property. So we'll say var data equals, and we'll use our curly brackets to create an object, and we'll say text, which again is just the property that's expected. If we go up here to create a to-do, we see text, and then whatever our string is for our text. So text, and then we'll say, what was it? New to-do. Oh, new title. New title dot value. And that's going to fill in this text property. And actually, I think this has to be quoted, right? Is it here? Yeah. Probably his here as well. No, it's not there. It probably will work either way, honestly. We'll go ahead and make sure that it works without it. Oops. Text, new title dot value. So we've got our data set up. Now we can go ahead, and this needs to be JSON encoded. We'll do this in our actual Ajax. You could do it now if you want, but I think it is just a little bit clear to go ahead and wait until then. So we'll do that by creating our XML HTTP request. So I always like to name these something relevant to what I'm doing. So I'm going to say var create request equals new XML HTTP request. And then it's like this, correct? Yep. So it's, this new here, we're constructing a new object. So this XML HTTP request has a constructor property to it. So we now have an XML HTTP request object that we can do the rest of our Ajax with. And so if we look over here, the first thing that we do is handle the onReady state change. So this is how we handle whatever happens when our request is made. Again, I find it a little bit, Ajax handles this a little bit more elegantly. It's a little bit confusing that we handle the success or error before we even really set up the response, but that's okay. So we're going to say create request dot on ready state change. Oh, it's all lowercase, of course. And we're going to say equals function. And then we have access to this property for the this ready state. So we're going to check. This will just go ahead and copy just because I don't want to type it all out. And then I'll walk you through it. So inside this function, so again, this function gets called every time the ready state changes, and it changes 4 times. So we won't console log it here just because for time. But if you console log the ready state here, you would see it console log, I think it's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Kind of annoying the way that works. I don't find it that cool. But what we really care about is ready state 4. When it's ready state 4, it means that the response has been received and processed, and it's ready to look at. And then we're also going to check this dot status and see if it's 200. So if ready state is 4 and status, is 200, meaning it was success, then we can go ahead and JSON parse the response. And we'll save this in a new variable. So we'll say var to-do equals JSON parse this response text, and we can console log it. Else, so I've got this if, and then I say else if ready state equals 4. So this is just the way that I typically do this. This will run if it was a success. And then else, as long as ready state is 4, go ahead and run this. So it means that the status is anything other than 200. So it means something bad has happened. There's some sort of error from the server. So and then I just console log this.response text to see what that error was. So for instance, let's go ahead and just make this text 123, just so that we can see what an error looks like. And we'll see how to handle that. Okay, so we've got our onReady state change. And then I'm not sure if I close this. Okay, that's the closing one. Put a semicolon there. So now we need to actually make our request. And there's a couple of things we have to do here. So first we'll call .open and we'll pass in our URL. And it will be true for, so we'll do create request open. And by the way, if you're using Visual Studio Code or Atom probably does this, they'll do some auto completion for you. So when you do .open, you'll see here you can go down and select open. And if you hit tab, no, in our case, it doesn't actually do anything. Sometimes it will kind of pre-fill for you. Yeah, it didn't really do anything for us. That's okay. So we're going to call open the request method. And even here it tells you, here you can see once we've hovered over it, what the method should be and then the URL. So our method is post because we're submitting data. Our URL is the, it's api.congage.net/todos. And again, you can get that from, right here. This is the URL that we submit to. And then after that, true. I think usually you can actually leave that off. But that's just saying that we do want to do it asynchronously. So it won't stop execution while waiting for the response. And then we need to set 2 request headers. So again, if you remember when we talked about HTTP, we've got headers, we've got a body. So we have to set a couple of headers that the server is expecting. So the first one is this set request header of content type. So we're telling the server, sorry, I can't talk and type at the same time. We're telling the server that the content type of our request is application/JSON. So this application/JSON is just a standard what the value should be when you're dealing with JSON. This could be application text, it could be HTML, it could be an image, PNG, whatever type of data we're sending, we have to identify that to the server so that it knows what to look for and knows how to handle it. The second thing we need to do is we need to send our API key. And we do that through a request header, which is kind of the standard way of sending API keys. So create request dot set request header. X API key is what we're supposed to send, and that's documented here in the documentation. So up here at the very top, the API key must be sent with every request to the API and is sent via header with a key of X API key. That's kind of a standard header to use for API keys. And then here, instead of this fake value, we're going to do our API key variable that already has stored. Then all we have to do is create request.send. And that's documented right here. Oh, we have to send our actual data though. So again, when you're sending a post request, you put the data that you're sending inside of that send method call. And we still need to JSON encode it. So we will do JSON.stringify data. So this data, again, is this object we created up here, and we're JSON stringifying it. So we're turning it into a JSON string. Okay, so that's all we need. So that will handle our post for us. So let's go ahead and see what happens. We've purposefully broken it. We are not sending the correct property in our data object just to see what the response is. So test, and we're going to send, okay, it's actually returning a worse error. Not all of the error states work properly in my API. It's a kind of a long subject. I'm using API Gateway in Amazon in front of Amazon Lambda, AWS Lambda, and it's something that's not configured quite correctly. Anyway, if you see an error like this, if you see origin null is not allowed, cannot load, it means there's something wrong with your request. So something is incorrect. The API should be working. It means that there's a problem with your request. In our case, we need to go ahead and change this back to just text. So we don't have real great error handling, unfortunately. I can't tell you exactly what's wrong. I should be able to. Most APIs will, and if I took the time to sort out the issues with AWS, it would. So now, if we do test and we hit enter, we're going to see that in the response is the full ToDo object. So we can see what all of the different things here, and it tells you what the type. So completed here is B for Boolean. It's false because by default they're not completed. It has a created and updated timestamp, which are going to be the same for now because we've only created. It has an ID field now, which is nice. It has text, and it has the user, which is just our API key that we sent. Okay, so the next step is to actually write this to the page. And this is right here, in our comment, display new to-do on page. So the way that we're going to do that, we could put a bunch of JavaScript here, on our success where we're console logging this to-do. We could certainly, put a bunch of, JavaScript here. However, I like to kind of keep my Ajax functions relatively compact because, we created up here. And if we've got, 30 lines of code in here, then this stuff is kind of too far down. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and remove these extra spaces, even though they're kind of nice to break it out, just because I really want to be able to see all of my Ajax request, in one screen. I want it to be pretty compact so that I know I can see everything that's happening. So instead of doing all of this here, what we're going to do is create a function to write that to-do data onto the page. So we're actually going to create, we'll just do one function and then we'll loop up there. Or no, sorry, we don't have to loop because we're only dealing with one to-do at this point. So we'll say function, and we're going to call this render to-do. And it's going to receive a to-do. Let's actually just go ahead and call this to-do data, because that's going to mean that this is the data with our to-do. So we create our function like this, and then we can just go ahead and console.log to-do data just to make sure we're getting it. And then up here, let's replace this console log to-do with a render to-do, and we're passing in this to-do variable. And in fact, we can even make this a little bit more compact by taking our JSON parse, this response text. I'm going to cut this and paste it in there, and then take that out. Typically, just a good programming habit, if you're creating a variable that you then only use once, typically you don't need that variable as an actual variable. In our case, we don't really need a to-do variable here. We can just directly call json.parse with the response text in our call of the render to-do function. So that just kind of cleans it up a little bit, keeps it shorter in one line. And if you're concerned about memory usage or something like that, we've got one less thing stored in memory now. So we can do that. So let's go ahead and save and refresh. and do a test. And we see our console log that we moved down to the render ToDo function. So again, let's kind of do some comments here just to kind of talk about what all we need to do. We need to create new ToDo container. We also want to add ID of ToDo as ID of container. We need to create complete button, add a ToDo text, and then we want to create delete button. We want to add ToDo to page. Then we also want to add event listeners for buttons. So kind of thinking through all the different steps that we need to do here. So the very first thing is to create a new ToDo container. So we can create an element using document.create element, and then you pass it the type of element you want to create. And in our HTML, I chose to use article for this. So I'm going to say article. Then I need to add the ID of the ToDo as the ID of the container. So, and actually, let me save this. So I'm going to say var ToDo equals document.create element article. Now I can call different methods on this element. So this is the same as if you've done document.getElement by ID or something like that. So I can say ToDo set attribute. I'm going to set the ID attribute, and then I'm going to set it to ToDo data.id. So again, the set attribute method call, the first parameter is what attribute we want to set. In our case, ID. It could be href or source if it's an image, something like that. And then the second parameter is the value that you want to set there. In our case, ToDoData.id is the ID of the ToDo. So now let's go ahead and console log it. Our ToDo. I'm going to get rid of this console log. Hopefully you can't hear my daughter crying in the background. She's supposed to be sleeping. I missed this semicolon here, so I'm going to put that. So again, I don't like to write more than a few lines of code before testing it, making sure it's working how I want it to, so it's easier to fix. So put in tests. So now we see our element console logged. This is great. We see it's an article and it has an ID with the ID of our ToDo. That's really great. We have got a good start. So next we need to delete this. We need to create the complete button. So putting in the button to do the completion. Again, the order here might be a little bit different for you. If you've got your complete button and your delete button on the same side, or you've got them on the right, just think about, what order you want to add them in your HTML. In my case, I've got the complete button on the left, then the text, then the delete button. So I'm going to do the complete button first, then the text, and then the delete button. So I'm going to create a new element for this. So var complete button equals document.create element, and it's a button. And autofill here, do not. Hopefully you can't hear that. Maybe you can. Poor Rose. She's a little bit sick right now, and so she's not sleeping so great. So create element button. I'm also going to add a class to my button just based on my HTML that I've already written. Oh, and I also need to add a class to my article. I chose the class check for my check button. So I'm going to add that here. So I will say complete button. I think, again, here's a good example of just Googling JavaScript add class. there's a couple of different ways to do it. We can certainly do property, we can do class list. Okay, oh no, it's jQuery that has an add class method. I really like that because it is a little bit cleaner. Let's see here. Okay, class list.add. That's good. We'll use that. Hopefully it'll work with none. Okay, cool. Class list.add. That's great. So complete button.classlist.add, and then we're going to give it our class. In our case, what is it? Check. Oops. Okay, and then let's also go ahead and do this up here as well. So ToDo.classlist.add ToDo. Other ways of doing this, you could do, you could just do ToDo.classlist equals and then ToDo. But if you need to do multiple ones, that starts to get a little bit tricky. You could do ToDo.classlist plus equals ToDo, or if it's, the problem here is that if it's the first one, this will work. If it's the second one, you really need a space here because you want a space between each class. So that's where this classlist.add is really nice. So we'll do that. Okay, let's go ahead and now do one more thing. Let's go ahead and add our button to our element. So at this point, we've got this ToDo element that's an article, and we've got this button, but they're not connected in any way. The button isn't inside of the article yet. We haven't done anything to tell it to do so. So we will do that by saying ToDo. So we're calling on our ToDo, append child, and we're going to pass it the complete button. So again, we're calling it on the ToDo that we created, and append child, which is going to add a new child element inside of our ToDo element, which is an article. So append a new child. And it's append, so it adds it to the existing children. This is the first one, so it's going to be the first element. And then we pass in the complete button that we've created. So let's go ahead and test. Let's do console.log the ToDo and make sure it's got our button inside of it. So go over here, we refresh, and we do test. We should now see this article. It's got our ID still. It now has the class, so that's great. And we can pop this up, and we see now that we've got our button with class of check. So that's really, really great. So let's finish this out. Let's add our ToDo text. So in my HTML, I used a paragraph tag for that. So I'm going to create a new paragraph tag. So var, ToDo text equals P. Doesn't have any classes on it. Nope. So all I have to do is then say ToDo text dot. There's a couple different ways you could do this. Inner HTML is one that we talked about. So you could just say inner HTML equals and whatever you want. In our case, we have the ToDo data.text. You can also do this using inner text. I believe it is that. It's not all caps like HTML. Again, sometimes JavaScript doesn't make any sense. So inner text equals ToDo data.text. The difference here should be pretty obvious. Inner HTML is setting the HTML inside an object, whereas inner text will set only the text. So the nice thing here, and this is kind of a security point, I'll do a brief tangent on web security. Let me show you what happens here. If we just do, well, we have to write this to the page. Let's go ahead and do that real fast. So we'll do document.get elements by ID ToDo's dot append child ToDo. So this is what we'll do at the very end to add our entire ToDo element we've created to the page. So append child. So let me go ahead and refresh and we'll just see if this works. So I'm kind of jumping ahead here. Okay, good. No, it's not quite working. Oh, it's because we haven't appended our paragraph. ToDo.append ToDo text. Okay, there it has a test. Let me show you a little, well, I'm not sure if this will work or not. It depends on how my API works. I'm not sure that I filtered this. Let's say that we wanted to get really fancy and we did like a, and we could even do badwebsite.com. I'm not sure if that's a real website or not. Test. Let's see if this works. Hey, it worked. So this is what there's a couple names for this problem. We can do some cross-site scripting here. This is certainly some improper input validation. We don't want this to happen because, for instance, well, what would happen probably is when we refresh the page, once we get, load in our existing ones, it would probably alert. Not exactly sure, that's good that that didn't work, but you could start to do stuff like this. We don't really want the user to be able to put any HTML they want and inject it into the page. They could do an image. I think that's, yeah, there we go, a little kitten. So we're just taking whatever, the user puts in here and injecting it as HTML. That's not a good thing to do. There's security issues. That's just not good. So by saying inner HTML, we're saying whatever is in this variable, put it in the HTML. What we can do instead is say inner text. And that's going to, it does very similar things. It just puts it inside, but it's going to make sure it's encoded only as text, and it's not going to allow any HTML to be put in there. So now if we refresh and we do like a link, what we should see is it's encoded as actual text. So we see the text of what they put in, not rendered as HTML. So if we did an image, we see just the text. So many reasons that we want to do it that way. It's better for security. The server should filter this stuff out, anyway. If I, built my API with a little more security in mind, it would filter this kind of thing out because, again, we don't want the user to be able to do that. There's a lot of security problems there. So I like to use inner text when I'm dealing with text. When I only want to take the text and put it in my HTML, use inner text. If you're using, if you want the user to be able to use like a strong tag or something, then maybe you'll use inner HTML. Anyway, that's how we create our text element. Set it to inner text, and then we're going to append our ToDo text to our ToDo. Again, I kind of jumped ahead here and I selected my container, get element by ID ToDo's, which is my section here, section with ID ToDo's, and I've append a child with my full to-do. So the last thing that we need to do is create our delete button. So we'll say var delete button equals, oops, type equals button. We're going to say classlist.add delete, I think is the class that I used. Again, you should already have these classes created when you're doing your styling. You have to delete. And then I'm also going to say, again, enter text, even though I'm not writing it with the variable, but it's just this little dash. And then I'll say todo.append child delete button. Okay, and then I've written it to the page. The last thing left is to do our event listeners. So once, we're going to add a semicolon here as well. I'm going to go ahead and create two functions. I'm going to say complete to do event, and then I'm going to say function delete to do, and these are going to be the functions that get run when I click my buttons. So then I'm going to console.log event, just to event. Now I need to add my click listeners to those buttons and have them call those functions. You have to do this after you add your to-do to the page. So you have to add it after this line. And that's because if you add it here, these elements haven't been added to our page yet. So if we add our click listeners, it won't know, it doesn't actually find those on the page yet. They're still just kind of virtual at this point. But if we put them after we actually write all those elements to the page, now we can create our click listeners. But we can still just do it based on the variables we've created. So we can do complete button dot add event listener. The event type is click, and then the function is complete to do. And then we'll do the same for click, or no, it's delete. Delete to do. So now it will add, the click listeners to those buttons, and it will call the functions we've created when those are clicked. So let's go ahead and test. This should do everything we want. So we're going to do test. So we've got our full to-do now added to the page. So that's great. It gets added after existing ones. It gets added once we hit enter. If we click our complete button, we see our mouse event logged. So that's great. If we click our delete button, we see our mouse event logged, which is great. So we can handle those click events. So we know there we need to do our, some Ajax and do some other stuff. There's one other thing that we need to do, which is, you'll notice, do a thing, I hit enter, it still has text in the input. For the user, it's added it, but for the user to have to add a new one, they then have to delete this and put in another thing. So we can handle that, pretty simply. We can select we've got our well, let's see, we'll just go ahead and select the, we'll just go ahead and select the input. So document.get element by ID and it is new to-do text, I think. Double check. Oh no, it's new title. Get one by ID, new title. And then we'll say dot value equals blank. So an empty string, and then hit our semicolon. So we're just saying set the value of this element, which is an input, to just an empty string. So just remove it. So element or value equals empty string. So now if we refresh, and we say test, and we hit enter, that gets cleared out. So our placeholder comes back because there's no data, and then I can type another one. Enter, and it adds it and it clears out my input. So we're off to a really good start.